Hello everyone and welcome in to this Cavalry tutorial. Today I'm going to show you the techniques that I use to create the series for 36 Days of Type using just Cavalry. And the technique that really makes this entire thing work is the image sampler, and it's one of my favorite tools, and I'm going to jump in right now and show you exactly why. Okay, here we are inside of Cavalry, and I've imported a couple of the scenes from the series just to show you a little bit about how they're structured and how they work. And you can see the image sampler is here, and it's really the key that drives all of these animations, and I'm going to show you exactly how to start using this. So first, let me just jump in and say that to use the image sampler properly, we really need to pre-render our objects. So I'm going to set my composition settings here to 12 frames and then change the background color to black. And this comp here is called 9 reference. This is going to be the reference footage that we use to drive the image sampler and give ourselves some Luma values to play with to drive our animations. And I want to bring an object, a text object, into the scene, so I can just hold Option and click on this text object, and then I'm going to center align it and vertically center align it and just change this number to 9, and then we'll make it a little bit bigger. And one of the things that Cavalry does pretty well is work with variable fonts, and we can animate their properties. And one of the ones that I like a lot is this one called Console. But I also use this other one called GeoGrotesque, and that is this sharp variable font trial. And I'm going to recreate, this is going to be the last animation in the series, so bear with me as I sort of create this from scratch here. But you can see that this font has some weight properties and width properties. And I want to be able to animate these, so I can just add keyframes to these various properties here. And I'm going to go forward in time to just 12 frames, and I'm going to zero out the weight here. And I don't want to increase the width yet, but now I'll jump ahead 24 frames and let's set the width to 1,000, and we'll zero this out, and then we'll set this to 1,000 and make a keyframe there again. And then I think let's just return to our base state here and make sure this is on frame 48. So we've got this shrinking, expanding back. And this animation is a little boring right now. It's a very linear one, so let's just grab all these keyframes, go into the graph editor, and then here there's an option for Bezier interpolation. I'm going to set all of these to Bezier curves, and now I've created a smoothing of this animation. Nice. I kind of like how that's feeling. So the black and white values of this comp are what will eventually drive the shape and the position and the other properties that we're trying to manipulate using the image sampler. So I'm going to set everything to black and white, so the 9 here will be white, and I'm going to just close this comp and let this loop at 48 frames by hitting N, which is just like the After Effects shortcut. And now I've created this little fun variable font animation using the number 9. Now, I want to create some gray values in between this, and there's a couple ways to do this. I think in this instance, I'm going to see how it looks with motion blur. So I can just have this text shape selected and then enable motion blur for it. Then I have to do this again in my comp settings, and I just need to turn on motion blur. And let's preview what this looks like. Now you can start to see a little bit of blur happening, which will give us some gray values, which is a nice little in-between state to affect our animation. And maybe I want this to be a little bit more exaggerated of a blur, so I'll set that to 360. Now we've got a bit more of it, and we can up the samples. Let's go to 600. Let's go to 60 and play this back and see how that looks. That's looking pretty nice. And you can see I'm RAM previewing by having this playback caching on. This will allow me to save my animation frames when I have to do some heavy lifting like this many sample motion blur. I could even try to exaggerate this even more because when it's in the technique, it will look a little bit cooler. This isn't the final result, obviously. This is just this sort of map that we're going to use. I can always come back and change this if I need to. Now that's looking pretty good. Okay, so we've got some good white and black values, and we've got some good gray in between. And I think what I want to do is actually lower this a little bit, so I'll just drag the Y position down. It was a little bit more centered in this comp. So I really need to pre-render this and bring it back into my scene to use in the image sampler properly. So what I'm going to do is hit Command B, which is my render settings here, my render manager. And I've imported some of the old render settings from previous comps by bringing all these other scenes in here. Let me clear these out real quick. Okay, so I have this comp now, it's called 9ref, and I have it set to render. I have a render sort of object for this. I want to change the format here to QuickTime, and we'll set this to ProRes 422 is fine. Now I want to put this in a folder, so I'll just change the render path. I have a project for 36 days of type, and this is just a location on my drive, which I can simply access by inserting in here the token @project, and then the renders folder. And then within renders, I'll create another folder and just call that folder 9ref. And then I don't have access to scripts here because I am not in the pro version, so I'm just showing you everything and how this can be done within the free version of Cavalry. So let me just render this to that folder. And that'll take just a second. You can see it made the folder here and it's rendering, and this will be done here momentarily. Great. So now I have this reference comp. I'm going to bring this into my scene, just dragging it in. And then I'm going to create a new composition. And I'm going to change the background settings again. Let's go black, and let's make an image sampler. And one of my favorite keyboard shortcuts within Cavalry is Command period to bring up the search for the tools that you're going to need. I'm going to search image sampler. And then I simply need to drag this 9ref video into the image asset. And now that's within my scene. But I'll turn this off for now. And I will rename this comp to 9. Okay, so now that we have this image sampler, how do we use the data or the values from these black and white to drive some kind of animation? Well, we're going to use a duplicator. And I'll just bring a duplicator into my scene. Actually, maybe let's start with the simplest version of this, which will probably be this circle here. And we'll set the circle size to 20 on the radius. Now I'll create a duplicator from this. By having the ellipse selected, I'm going to just click this duplicator in this shelf here, and this will create a simple duplicator object using this ellipse shape as its input shape. And I'm going to change the count eventually. Let me fix the size first. So in this duplicator, we have options for size mode, and you can either fit it to the dimensions that you set here, or you can change it to step, which is their object's position related to one another. So let's just set this to, we'll go in even 40 just to have it all sort of perfectly aligned. If you enter one value into here, like a 40, and then hold Option while you hit Enter, it will automatically set the other value connected to it as well. So now that this grid size is correctly shaped, let's hold Option and drag to increase the size of the number of duplicates that we have to basically cover our entire comp. Okay, so let's turn this image sampler off. Nothing's really going on here just yet, so in order to make this work, we need to connect the image sampler to this shape. And we can do this in a number of ways. But the image sampler essentially is going to spit out a value between 0 and 1 based on whether or not on this comp a pixel is black or white. So I could connect this directly to a duplicator shape scale like this, shape scale XY, and you can see automatically it's now going to reference our image asset and change the scale of each of these objects based on where or what the pixel value is. But we don't necessarily always want to use a range between 0 and 1 to drive a property, because really anything between 0 and 1 can be remapped to a new value. And if you're familiar with After Effects, this is like the linear function, or if you're familiar with Cinema 4D, this is like the range mapper function within Expresso. And so in Cavalry, that's called a number range. And it's a really simple input-output, and we can take this image sampler and connect the output of this image sampler by selecting this little blue dot here and dragging this right onto the number range. We have all the options of which properties this can connect to. So we'll connect it to value, and then we need to know what the min and max of the input value is. Here it's called source min, source max. So I'm going to take things between 0 and 1 and then remap them to a size between 0 and 100. And so with this base, we could do something simple like a color blend. So I'll take a color blend object. I'll search for that using command period. And then I'll connect this color blend to this ellipse shape fill color. And now I want to connect this number range to this color blend strength. So now these values are going to interpolate between this brightest point of the gradient, which matches up to 1, and this darkest point. So now we've remapped the 0 to 1 to 0 to 100, and we're affecting the strength of our color blend. So now you can see how we're stacking the same image sampler using multiple different properties to affect our animation. So one thing I need to do here is hit Command K and change this frame rate setting back down to 12 so that these match, and then I think I had 48 frames, so I'll set the out point here, and now we've got our loop that is pretty much matching. Because I have a really thin width on the shape of this 9, I'm actually going to have to reduce probably the size of this ellipse, which I can do dynamically here. This will create quite a few duplicates, but I'll go down to 10, hold option, and then we will reduce the size of this to 20, so that should all match. And then we're going to need to set the count to 50. Okay, so now we've got our 9, and I want you to just think about all the other ways that we can use the image sampler and this data to remap it to things to affect their properties. So some of the examples that people asked me to share were ones like this number 8, which just went out yesterday. And really the idea is all the same. I'm using the image sampler, and I've connected to a number range, and then this number range is connected, in this case, to an animation control. So the range is 0 to 100, and this animation control controls this eye path animation and the iris scale. So as the values become darker or lighter, it changes the animation path based on its percentage. And that's what the animation controller is just able to do. You can connect this animation controller to any set of keyframes, and now you've just created a percentage value to animate between the start and end points of that animation. I think in this number 6, I'm using circles again. I've got some fun filters and techniques on here, and there's really nothing fancy about the input of this one. The difference here is I'm using color blend, and on this color blend I have simply said at the white points we're going to be totally white, and then we're going to fade quickly to yellow and then red, so we can sort of manipulate and change the colors based on this. Color blend actually offers a ton of really cool features. We could even connect something to this color blend like a color array. And in order to show you this, I'm going to use a palette that I've created or found online. One way that you can bring new palettes into Cavalry is to use an Adobe Swatch Exchange file. So you can search online for other Adobe Swatch Exchange files and just import them right into your scene. Coolers.io is one of those platforms that'll let you generate a quick 5-color palette and then export an ASE and bring that into your comp. But you can also find some others online. Why don't I use, we'll stick with this colorful one here. And when I have this library palette loaded, underneath of this little options icon, I have this option to create an array from palette. And so what this will do is create a list, really, of colors that I can use. And within the color blend, I could actually create a new color, maybe right at the midpoint here, and connect this color array to this blend. So now you can see as it fades from white, it's actually going to interpolate between the colors that are available to us based on this color array before it then fades back down to black. And honestly, I also want to set this to a stepped version. Yes, here we go. And that way we're not really fading. These colors are always going to be at their actual brightness and color value, not somewhere in between black and white. But the blend gradient will sort of linearly fade between the colors that are on this list. But here, now I've created something. There's got a little bit of a pattern to it, and I actually want to eliminate that by turning off auto index. And you can see this is even a cool look unto itself, but I want to actually change these so that maybe I'll delete these two values too. I don't really need these whites because I already have white. So now we've got 7 colors to choose from. So on this index, now that I've turned off auto index, I can assign these colors in a random way to the shapes that are getting fed this color by the value of the blend. So I can right click index, add behavior, let's go noise. And in this noise, I want to set these values to -0.5 and 6.5. And essentially that'll just set my range of all of these indices here. So -0.5 rounds up to 0 and 6.5 will round down to 6, and therefore we've sort of taken advantage of the range in the best way we can. And what the noise will do is randomly assign these values, and it'll even change over time, so it creates a little bit of nuance and variation within this animation. Okay, so before I continue, I do want to jump into maybe one of the most powerful techniques in this, which makes this whole thing really fun and exciting, which is to offset these in time. And when I found out that I could change the image sampler time offset, like the animation was treated within time and could be staggered, it was actually really eye-opening, and it creates a ton of new possibilities for playing with these animations. So within the duplicator, I'll go to shape time offset, and then I'll just add a behavior and call this one stagger. And now I've set a stagger 6 frames between these animations. So essentially what this is saying is, in a linear fashion, up and down between these duplicates, I'm going to stagger the time at which they're inheriting their values. So now you can see if the value here was at 0 and the value here is now offset by 12 frames across this entire duplicator. And it creates this fun little ease and sort of flow and morph to the shape. And we can also exaggerate this even more by changing the way that these indices are distributed. You can see naturally, and this will get a little messy here, but we're going to look at all of the indices and how they are listed on the duplicator. So essentially at the top here, we're at 2450. That's the 2450th index is at that position. As you can see, they're moving up and down, and 1 should be 0 is here and 1 is here. But we have a number of ways to control the order of which these objects are given their indices. And one of them, we could flip the stagger simply by going into stagger and taking this graph and changing the way it's distributed. That will change the up and down nature of this. The indices don't change themselves, but the order in which the stagger is applied does. Or we could do something like inside of this duplicator, under distribution, this is the standard grid, we have an option here to sort. And this is like a little retina bug. I don't know exactly how to fix this, but the menu is getting cut off. But we do have the option to sort here. And so what a sort is a additive distribution. So you can take any distribution and then add a sort to that, and that will then allow you to resort the indices of these objects in a couple different methods of your choice. Now we can choose this horizontal method, and now it will go from 0 to whatever our max number is, up and down instead of left and right. And we could also do it from the centroid, which is probably one of the most fun ones. This is saying the centroid of our duplicator, the indices near here are going to determine the index at which this shape is. So we're at 0, 1, 2, 3. It's the distance from this point that is determining exactly which number index is being assigned here. So the values will be sort of distributed in an outward fashion from the center. And that gets a little laggy there, but now when you see me play this back, you can see we have this thing happening where the shape sort of conforms in on itself. And lastly, with this, just to show you, you can actually choose a target for that. Say you wanted it to be in the corner, you could set a null, and we'll change this null to be our distribution target, distance from, select the duplicator, go distance from target, and then drag this null in here. And so now this null is what is driving our indexes. So maybe I'll put it at the bottom right here, and things will sort of happen from the text corner of this shape, which is actually producing a pretty fun result as well. Now, a couple people wanted to know about how to do number 4, and number 4 is using a duplicator, which I have set to a distribution of submesh, and the submesh here is this quad tree. And now a quad tree within Cavalry, I could just make a new one here, search quad tree. Quad tree is just a really fun way to generate these sort of concentric patterns, and we can use this. Each of these blocks then becomes a point at which this shape is being distributed, and if we use that, then actually the size of the shape will be determined by the size of that block. And then we've also got here a text shape, and this text shape is being driven by a string generator, and this string generator has an ISKI pattern. Now this is a thing that I used on a couple different techniques during the 36 Days of Type series. Essentially found this ISKI pattern online as a way to sort of change the density of characters in order to draw images, and it creates a really fun looking effect when then you map the image sampler onto this. So the 4 is my maximum value here, and then I have a space at the end. So somewhere in between 1 and 0, or 0 and 1, I'm assigning these new values. There's, I think, 27, 29 shapes in here. So this string has a manipulator on it, and this is just this one here, which allows me to substring. And so I'm going to substring, choosing each character individually between -0.5 and 28.5. I'm going to, as the black and white values change, pull a different ISKI number from each of that string. That one's kind of hard to explain, but I think that makes sense, hopefully. In this Z one, we have a pretty similar technique to what we've already built here. And in V, this goes back to the technique of animating using the keyframe properties. Or here I've changed the color using a color array. And each of these have a little drop shadow on them. This is just an SVG that is being duplicated. And then the scale is being driven by a number range, and the rotation is being driven by a number range. And then here also the distribution is set to a Fibonacci pattern, which is this sort of perfect spiral looking shape where no objects ever really overlap with one another. It's a pattern found in nature, the golden ratio, and it's built right in as a distribution type within Cavalry, and it doesn't really matter. As long as you have a single duplicator, you can choose any distribution type, and the place of the pixels within your scene based on the image sampler will drive whatever clone happens to be closest to them. You can see as I sort of drag all this away, you can see how the V shape sort of always stays intact, and that's exactly why this technique is so powerful. It's really hard to break as long as you've got some distribution that fits within your scene. The black and white values of your image sampler will continue to drive this animation. With 0, I think I have a simple, well, I've chosen some separate typefaces here, but let's not get into that. That might be a little complicated. At the simplest form, I have a text shape that is being driven by a string generator here, yet again, but here I'm just using values between 0 and 9, and then I've reversed them. So the image sampler is being fed here, and now remapping those values to 0 and 9 and automatically generating the string number for these objects. And then I'm also using the color blend as a way to show a gradation of color between white and black and, well, purple here. The W is the same thing as what I did with the 4, which is a quad tree distribution. And here again, a color blend, and connected to that is a color array into our middle value. And S is something I think is pretty similar to what we've created here. We're changing the color of the shapes that have gray values and in reducing the scale of them. And I think that pretty much covers it. I could create, more intricacy into this animation. Maybe there's one last thing I want to show you here, which is back in this 4 shape, I also have a variation on the pattern. So I can use, again, this image sampler to drive almost any property within Cavalry. So here I'm also using it to change the shape of the duplicator. So this duplicator has 3 input shapes: the group, which is my number; the rectangle shape, which is really now this one, I just trimmed the corner off of it and it's become this triangle shape; and I have an ellipse shape. And what I can do to affect those shapes is actually change the shape ID, or here I have automatically just kept, I'm using all 3 of those to generate different patterns in here. Maybe I want to show you actually, let's go import scene Y. This one was one of my favorites, and this will be a better example. So here I've created individual shapes for each of the different values, and those are all listed here. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different shapes that I'm working with. And what I've done is I've taken off auto ID on my duplicator, which is automatically assigning each shape sequentially. So I don't want the duplicator to assign these shapes. I actually want to assign them myself based on the black and white values of my image. So you can see I've got these other shapes here. So white is white, and that's the full square, but I want to change the density of these things. So then why don't I disconnect this? Hold on. We are duplicator, input shapes, shape ID is number range. Yes. So you can see as I drag these through, I can set, so all my white values are this fully in shape, and then in between is this sort of outline with the X, and then the empty outline, and then just a plus, and then just an outline shape, and then a smaller shape, and then we go back to 0. And this creates a really fun pattern that allows me to change or use the image sampler yet again to drive yet another property. And here we're choosing density of this shape. I think this is pretty comprehensive of all the things that you're able to do with the image sampler and the way that you can use that data to remap to fit any property that you need it to. And you can get really creative with this. And one of the things I want to just finish this off by showing you is some of the more raster based effects, because essentially everything here has been all vector. These are all vector shapes. I could zoom in here infinitely. It will always retain, and you can see how fast this is working with these vector shapes. But I actually want to start now creating some raster effects that help me create some of the more glitchy and fancy looks throughout the finished pieces. And actually, you know what I'm going to do is make this one something I like a little bit more. I've used this pattern a little bit too much. I'm over it. So in the color blend, I'm actually going to change this color. I think I actually liked this green here when we saw it earlier. Like, I think that looks pretty cool, and I want to use that, but now I want to create a little bit more color variation from that without actually manipulating the colors of the circle. So one of my favorite filters in here, if you select the duplicator, go to filters, is to go to the chromatic aberration filter. And this thing allows you to essentially create like a lens distortion where the colors are starting to separate the closer to the edges of the camera that you get. And you can see there's some allusion to camera effects in here, talking about the lens radius here. I couldn't tell you what this value actually means. It's not that important, but some of these things can get really cool. You can create a blur this way by duplicating this many times over, and you can see how the colors are starting to separate. So the RGB of whatever that color value is starts to get split off, and if you up the green one, you can see how that comes further away. Let's change that back to the default 130. You can see the blue here, and we can send it away from the camera lens or towards it by increasing these values. And I just want to create some color variation from this that I think looks pretty nifty, and adding a little bit of contrast to this green by maybe sending the green back and introducing some more red into the scene. Sounds like something that I want to do. I also want to get some magenta in here, and I think I can do that with the blue offset. Yeah, let's set the blue offset here. So now I've created this color contrast within this single color animation. And one of the techniques that I think people really liked was the one where we actually reverse this lens. Instead of being concave, we'll go fisheye and barrel. And what that's going to do is on the edges, it's really going to drag out those pixels that they become these solid lines from, which creates a really interesting looking technique. And if I play this back, you can see I've got this sort of glitchy, crazy LED screen, concert visual sort of graphic going on here. And we can change some of these effects by increasing the strength, maybe a little bit more. If we reduce the padding, we can prevent that from going all the way to the edges, but I think it's actually something that I like, and I think that might be where we're at. We'll increase the padding all the way to the edge. Yeah, I like the way that starts to bend. So now we've created this really interesting, complex animation, but it's all very live and editable, and we can change these shapes, and this is just one of the fun raster effects. And the other raster effect that I like to use a lot on these animations is the dithering effect, and this will just create a little bit of a less than perfect feel. We're going to grunge it up. I like to reduce the size of my dither pattern down to 2, just like every 2 pixels essentially we're bayering, creating a pattern like that. It just makes it less than perfect white and gives us a little bit more variation in the animation. And then we can take the bit depth up. We want to keep some of our colors in here. We don't need to totally crunch it. Let's go up to 8. So now we've created this effect that has everything that we've used to create the 36 Days of Type series. I hope that you guys got something from this tutorial. That's basically the technique that I used to do this entire 36 Days of Type series, and it's all accessible in the completely free version of Cavalry. There are some other techniques we could get into about advanced techniques and with scripts and some things that I used, and maybe that'll come in another lesson. But for now, I hope that this has sort of unlocked in your mind the potential of this completely free program to create some really complex animations and things that really aren't capable of being done in other 2D animation applications. Please let me know in the comments if anything is confusing or if you need any questions answered. You can also follow me on Instagram and hit me up there in my DMs. If you have any questions whatsoever, I'm happy to reach out. And that's all for now, guys. I can't wait to see you in the next tutorial.